Welcome back to Philosophy and Ethics in Games, the series where I break down the stories in some of our favorite games and ask the tough questions to figure out what is right and what is wrong. I'm Josh Bearheart Hawk, and today we're saddling up and continuing the march east in Red Dead Redemption 2 as the Van der Linde gang makes camp at Clemens Point. In case you missed any of the previous episodes in the Philosophy and Ethics series, I've linked a playlist in the description below. As I continue to break down this and other games, I'll add new videos to the playlist so you can find them all in one place. Clemens Point might just be the highest point of the Van der Linde gang's flight toward the sun. They only barely escaped the law near Valentine, having at least one person shot as they fled, and it was only through the mere chance that they were able to find a good enough spot to stay hidden from the Pinkertons in Lemoyne. As the chapter opens, we find Dutch and Arthur arguing about the state of things, very similar to how Dutch and Hosea started in Chapter 2. Arthur is worried about the direction Dutch is taking the gang, how they've been losing people, and how they can't seem to catch a break. Dutch counters Arthur's worries in a very similar manner to how he countered Hosea, by pointing out their goals and even saying that some sacrifices will have to be made as they work to achieve those goals. But Dutch's goals aren't really too clear here. Most of what he's been focused on up to this point revolved around making money and getting the gang somewhere safe. But as he talks to Arthur now, he insists they are trying to reform society to a kinder, truer, better way. The initial focus of the gang, way back when it first started, was supposedly around helping people and making a better world. But nothing we've seen Dutch do to this point would show that he is focused on anything outside of the gang. From the ferry robbery to the train robbery and everything that happened in Valentine, Dutch has been laser focused on the gang and only the gang. Or at least that's what he tells us. Let's be real, the choice to rob the ferry in the first place wasn't smart, and going after Cornwall's train in the mountains was about the worst decision that he could have made in the moment. If he was really focused on the gang, he wouldn't have put them in so much danger. They've lost Davy, Mac, and Jenny, nearly lost John and Sean, and could easily have frozen or starved to death in Coulter. Despite his overall history, Dutch hasn't really been a good leader in recent months. Dutch, Hosea, and Arthur ride off to explore their new surroundings, with the promise of a day of fishing to look forward to. But as we well know, anything involving Dutch is going to be a bit more complicated than that. A short way into the ride, they come across a stopped train and a couple of local lawmen with a wagon full of what are presumably criminals. And one of the criminals just so happens to be Josiah Trelawney. He showed up in Chapter 2 as well, with information on Sean's whereabouts, and this time he is in need of our help. Dutch is able to distract the lawman driving the wagon long enough for one of the captives to pick the lock and get the door open, and Arthur is tasked with helping one of the deputies recover the prisoners as they run off. It turns out the men in the wagon with Trelawney are part of a local gang known as the Anderson Boys. And once Arthur and the deputy have stopped them and secured the leader of the group on Arthur's horse, the pair ride into Rhodes to lock the man away once more. The whole situation winds up ingratiating Dutch, Arthur, and Hosea with Sheriff Gray, a member of one of the two rival main families that call Rhodes home. And the ride back to Rhodes is where we find out the first snippets about the families, the Grays and the Braithwaites. Both families own a lot of land, and they each claim to have a large fortune to their name. There's a feud between them, some pre-Civil War era hatred that has gone on for decades, and Dutch immediately focuses on learning as much about both families as possible. We can guess pretty early on that he will be aiming to steal something from each family, as their supposed wealth is just too much to pass up. But these warring families don't just give us someone to try and rob, they provide a peek into high society and show us that while the outlaw gangs may be on the way out, the outlaw way of life isn't really dying so much as it is changing. Gangs like the Van der Lindes thrive on chaos, robbing people and breaking laws they don't like in an attempt to stay free and live however they see fit. Families like the Greys and the Braithwaites, however, are more sophisticated gangs, bending the law to their will through power and influence. This allows them to thrive and avoid the pitfalls of running with an outlaw gang while enjoying the lifestyle that comes with that way of life. The Greys are the law in Rhodes, with Sheriff Grey calling the shots, and they own many of the local businesses, while the Braithwaites have their hand in more illicit endeavors, garnering support from the locals who don't like the way that the Greys run things. But the external family feud isn't the only focus in the chapter, as an internal feud is brewing within the Vanderlyn gang. Where Horseshoe Overlook almost felt like a new beginning, with a beautiful view and warmer weather, Clemens Point is hot and muggy, and tempers are starting to show. The first indication of a problem with this camp comes from Sadie and Pearson, who seemingly can't stand each other, as Sadie fights to do more than just act as Pearson's assistant. She's not happy being stuck at camp, and Arthur helps alleviate some of the tension by taking her into town to shop for supplies. The whole thing wouldn't be too much more than a blip on the radar, except for the introduction on the way back to the camp to the Lemoyne Raiders. The Raiders are a group of bandits who never got over the Civil War, and who think the South is still fighting. They rob and terrorize people all throughout Lemoyne, and quite frankly, I'm surprised they exist at all. I mean, it's just so unrealistic that a group of people who lost a war like that would still be claiming victory and crying about how they didn't really lose and were going to rise up again someday. With all the attention to detail Rockstar gave this game, I can't believe that bit slipped through the cracks. Sarcasm aside, the little trip into town helps Sadie's mood, and Arthur moves on to bigger things, like jumping into the southern retelling of Romeo and Juliet. Dutch asks Arthur to look into the Greys, and the very first person he meets upon visiting their estate, aside from some very grumpy guards, is Beau Gray, the nephew of the sheriff. He seems to be pretty level-headed, all things considered, calling out what he sees as the obvious plan the Vanderlyn gang has to take advantage of the families, while also asking for Arthur's help to deliver a letter to the woman he loves, Penelope Braithwaite. Penelope is a little more difficult to reach, as the Braithwaites apparently have their property a lot more locked down than the Greys, but delivering the letter and gift Beau provided gets us a foot in the door there as well. And the relationship between Penelope and Beau is more than just a romantic storyline. It's a mirror in a lot of ways to the fight the Vanderlyn gang is facing with the encroachment of society and the rule of law on their way of life. On the one hand, you have the older and more dedicated members of the Greys and Braithwaites, fighting an old battle and holding tightly onto a way of doing things that doesn't make sense. Most of them can't even remember which side started the feud, or explain why they hate each other so much. They just cling to it like their lives depend on it. In the same way, the Vanderlyn gang is clinging to an outdated way of life that really doesn't make a lot of sense. They have to live every day wondering if some other gang or the law is going to take them out. And they have to worry every time they go anywhere close to other groups of people if they're going to be recognized. Most of them couldn't even give a solid reason, outside of freedom or riches, as to why they are outlaws. And they've had chances to melt into society, with several members of the gang drifting in and out of the life over the years, but they always come back like it's some kind of drug. And that's juxtaposed with the law, or new way of doing things, that threatens the life they know. The Pinkertons, and society writ large, are a direct threat to their way of doing things in the same way that the relationship between Beau and Penelope is a threat to the feud between the Greys and the Braithwaites. If Beau and Penelope are allowed to be together, it means the feud might die off, and most of the other members of each family wouldn't know what to do if that happened. In the same way, some members of the Vanderlyn gang would likely be fine if they had to reintegrate into society, but many wouldn't know how to survive if the daily fight for survival wasn't there. And the old way versus the new way theme exists in more places, as we assist Beau and Penelope with another situation where Penelope is joining a group of women protesting for the right to vote. Arthur winds up as a wagon driver as the group parades through the streets of Rhodes, and we see several people coming out to jeer as they roll along. Personally, this was one of the more fun missions for me, as I was wrapped up in the history of the moment. U.S. history is one of my favorite subjects overall, and to be able to ride into something that would have been very similar to a protest in the real-life women's suffrage movement is actually kind of cool. My fangirling over the history in a video game aside, the only real point of note in the story overall here is how Beau seems to cast some doubt on whether either family has the money they are rumored to have. He and Arthur leave the suffrage protest after his cousins show up to hassle him for being there. And as they are getting ready to part ways, he mentions that the rumors of the Braithwaites having Yankee gold may be nothing more than a story. At the same time, he also admits that he isn't entirely sure of his own family's financial situation either. And we're left to wonder whether this whole thing is going to be even worth it if both families are secretly broke. And we get a little more background on the families and their feud from the deputy, Archibald, as Arthur, Bill, and Dutch, who have been officially deputized by Sheriff Gray, accompany him to take down one of the Braithwaites' moonshine stills. Archibald seems to be under the impression that any gold may be long gone, saying that both families claim the other stole it at some point in the past. So we've got two families here, both of whom claim to be wealthy and who both hate the other with a passion. They've both obviously got some money, or at least some value, in the fact that they own land and have big houses with servants, and that right there is something to focus on for a minute. They might both be, for all intents and purposes, broke. Not broke like you and I might think, where we struggle to pay the rent or buy groceries, but broke from a rich person's perspective, where they have the appearance of wealth while simultaneously not actually having any real currency. They live in a form of high society, but only because they are able to keep up appearances in the community. They have the power and control over the important pieces, like the law and criminal enterprises, but that power is a very carefully woven mirage. And while that seems at first glance like a problem, it's actually a common thing even in the real world when it comes to wealthy individuals and families. Most people think that the wealthy in society are simply chasing wealth for the sake of having more money. But in reality, while many wealthy families certainly have a lot of money, what they really seek is power, because money can only get you so far. Sure, money can buy you nice things and allow you to hire servants and security, but one can only have so many nice cars and houses before adding to those collections gets boring. So they chase the one thing that is more desirable than gold: power. Families like the Grays and the Braithwaites wouldn't need to have mountains of gold if they had control over the local population. They could even sell some of that control to outside entities, leveraging a stake in local affairs for status in other places like nearby Saint Denis. But we can't go that far just yet, as we still have some robbing to do around Rhodes. Arthur, Dutch, and Bill successfully shut down the moonshine still and wind up confiscating the spoils in the form of a wagon full of moonshine. That moonshine gives them an in at the Braithwaites' place, as Hosea comes up with the brilliant idea of selling it back to the people they stole it from. Under most circumstances, Catherine Braithwaite, the matron of the Braithwaite family, would likely shoot anyone that brazen on sight. But she seems to take a liking to Hosea, and she seems to think that the whole situation is an opportunity to get one up on the Grays. Not only does she agree to pay the men for returning the shine, but she offers them a little extra to take the load into town and give it away at the bar. That plan works out for the most part, at least until some Lemoyne raiders show up and shut the party down. They were apparently planning to buy the liquor from the Braithwaites, and they aren't happy that someone else got to it first. And can I just say how insane this whole situation is? On one side, we have a family that is literally above the law, running the sheriff's office and half the businesses in town. And on the other, we have one that is not only in bed with a gang of raiders that makes the Vanderlyn gang look docile, but is also tied to or running most of the criminal elements in the state. And I'm not the only one who notices how wild Rhodes is, as Dutch and Micah both see it too. As Arthur returns from his wild night at the bar as a bartender, he's clued into the latest plan, as Micah has once again gotten into Dutch's head and convinced him that robbing both families blind is a good idea. And like all of Dutch's plans, this one is just horrible and will never really pay off the way that they think it will. We have a mountain of evidence that neither family has the riches they claim, but none of that matters when it comes to Dutch Vanderlyn's incessant drive to have all of the money in the world. At this point, I think the gang could successfully rob every bank, ferry, and family from Saint Denis to New Austin, and Dutch would still be complaining that they need more money. And there is no shortage of ways to make money, as Bill, Karen, and Lenny convince Arthur to go with them back to Valentine to rob the bank. It's one of those things that they feel is important to do in every town, but that they weren't able to complete before all hell broke loose, and they had to leave. Robbing the bank is really a cover, however, for the return to the Downs Ranch at the behest of Strauss. He tells Arthur that Mr. Downs has died and says that means that Mrs. Downs assumes the debt. Ethically speaking, this is an abhorrent practice that even happens in some cases in the modern world. When a person dies, the debt they accrued in life can sometimes be passed on to their surviving spouse or children, though how much and what kind of debt can be passed is based on where you live, as different states have different rules about it. And that's one of those areas where we talk about legality versus ethicality. There are a lot of things that are unethical, but wind up being legal because laws are often written by those with enough money to make anything happen. We talked earlier about how the Greys run the law in Rhodes, meaning that the laws are based on whatever works best for them. If, for instance, they only wanted certain types of liquor sold locally, a brand that came from a company they owned or worked closely with, while banning certain other types like moonshine brewed by a family they don't like, they could make that law. And that doesn't just apply to local bands of crooked families. It extends nationwide when we look at people like Leviticus Cornwall. Cornwall was able to march into Valentine in the last chapter and have his men get into a shootout with the Vanderlyn gang, putting innocent lives at risk in the process, with no repercussions. He is rich enough to buy politicians and make the law bend to his will, and he is used to getting what he wants. And that's the kind of thing I think the Dutch and the gang are running away from at the end of the day. Sure, laws restricting freedom are frustrating, but when those laws are written by men who don't have to follow the law themselves, it's only natural that there would be groups of people like the Vanderlyn gang that refuse to go along. The Greys, the Braithwaites, and Cornwall are all examples of people living the life that Dutch Vanderlyn wants to live, having the ability to do what they want when they want. But as we finish the Valentine bank robbery and return to camp, we have to question how much money Dutch thinks the gang needs. That job alone brings in $10,000 for the gang savings, adding to whatever else has been contributed through other jobs, and meaning the gang has the modern equivalent of almost $400,000 in cash in a box stashed outside the camp. That should be more than enough to head west and buy some land, as Dutch proposed in an earlier conversation. As a real-world example of how much land could potentially be bought in 1899 and how much it would cost, I found a 300-acre tract of land in Colorado selling for $25 an acre. That would total about $7,500, which falls well within the gang's budget and is more than enough land for them to start a life on. And don't even get me started on how the gang could retrieve the money that they left in Blackwater using stealth and members of the Pinkertons aren't as familiar with to do so, adding to the overall total and making their dreams of disappearing easily accessible. The only thing preventing them from doing this, as usual, is Dutch. As we chase his imaginary pot of gold throughout Lemoyne, Arthur, John, and Javier end up stealing some horses from the Braithwaites, and Arthur works with Sean to burn the Gray's tobacco fields, as both families are brought to their knees. But these crimes won't go unpunished. Just when the gang thinks they've got the upper hand in the feud between the families, they are blindsided by an attack in Rhodes from the sheriff and a large contingent of Greys who finally caught on to their shenanigans. Sean pays the highest price for the recent acts as he's shot in the head before Arthur, Bill, and Micah clear the town of residents. This might be the worst moment for the gang since Blackwater, except things get worse as Arthur rides back to camp to find out that John's son, Jack, has been taken by the Braithwaites. All the king's horses and all the king's men ride off into the night in what might very well be one of the most badass moments in the game as the gang lays siege to the Braithwaite estate in search of the boy. There is an incredible amount of resistance as every inbred farmer for miles around rallies to the mansion before the gang finally drags old Ma Braithwaite from the burning house to reveal that Jack has been sent to Saint Denis and left in the care of a man named Angelo Bronte. Leaving the old woman to her fate, the group rides back to camp to prepare for the next steps, only to find themselves being accosted by agents Milton and Ross. Now, this moment really says a lot about both the gang and the Pinkerton agents. Milton offers every member of the gang the chance to escape if Dutch goes quietly with them into custody. Logically, Milton and Ross could have invaded the camp with 100 men if they really wanted to, taking no prisoners and putting an end to the gang's existence in one foul swoop. But he chooses instead to try and reason with them. He is supposedly the bad guy, the one that the gang is supposed to fear, and yet he is showing them way more mercy than some of them probably deserve. Dutch stands up and offers to go with them, but the gang comes to his defense, with everyone pulling their guns and aiming at the agents without even a second thought. On the surface, Dutch offering himself up would seem like a moment of bravery, like he was actually willing to give himself up to save the gang. But the reality isn't that simple. Dutch knew they would stand up for him. He spent years brainwashing them into his way of thinking and doing things, and he knows that every one of them would be willing to die for each other and for him. If he truly wanted what was best, if he actually cared for them the way that he pretends, he would tell them to lower their weapons and allow himself to be arrested and face the consequences of his actions. The rest of the gang would be free to go their separate ways or stick together, and so long as they were integrated into society, it's likely they would all fare well in the long term. And he has no reason to think the agents would go back on their word, as this is the second time they've approached the gang with offers of freedom, though it's the first time they've visited the camp. They really only want Dutch because he's the leader and the one that killed the girl on the ferry. Taking him down takes away the driving force for some of the more horrific things the gang has done and brings justice to a lot of people. But of course, Dutch would never give himself up to save anyone, despite his claim from the very first chapter that,
"Now, if I could throw myself in the ground in their stead, I'd do it gladly."
He isn't the type to actually go through with that promise when it counts. With the Pinkertons knowing their location and a missing boy to deal with, the gang packs up and makes their way to a spot not too far away that Arthur and Linde discovered a few weeks back called Shady Belle. It's a rundown, old building that was likely once as beautiful as any other plantation house in the area. And it serves as the home base for the next chapter of the Van der Linde gang's story. But that's for next week. The gang continues to move east, further and further into the jaws of civilization, as the grip of the law tightens around their necks. In Rhodes, they discovered that the height of society isn't really a lot better than the outlaws it pretends to hate, but Saint Denis will ratchet things up another notch and reveal the worst in Dutch to those closest to him. You aren't going to want to miss my breakdown of Chapter 4, or the rest of the game for that matter. To make sure you get notified of new videos, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Tell YouTube that you enjoyed the video as well by hitting the like button, and check out other games that I've covered in the Philosophy and Ethics series in the playlist linked in the description. If you want to help support the channel in other ways, I've got channel memberships and a Patreon. Signing up for either of those gets your name in videos, early access, and behind-the-scenes content. That's all I've got for this one. I want to thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.